Hello and welcome in. It is a Sunday edition of Always College Football, and I'm your host, Greg McElroy. We appreciate you being here. It is October 27th, so we're just a couple days away from November. And there are some teams right now in college football that are playing at a clip above just about anybody else. And a few of those teams were not on the bingo card in the preseason. We'll dive in to some of the unexpected storylines that have transpired over the first 9 weeks of the season that now has us with a handful of undefeateds that we would have never anticipated. We have a lot to look forward to here, I think, in the final month of the season. We have playoff rankings that will start on November 5th. I still think there's a lot of people that are still trying to figure out how those playoffs going to all be formatted. I, myself included, because I know I got a beat on what the 4-team playoff was going to look like, but I don't know what the 12 team is going to look like and what the committee will value, but it's a lot of things coming up, but a lot that we need to look forward to as well. We're going to break down the games from this past weekend. This is our Sunday immediate rapid reaction, stream of consciousness when it comes to some of these games. Yesterday, I was in New Jersey, doing Notre Dame and Navy game, and that game got sideways. So I was able to watch a little bit of what was going on with Ohio State and Nebraska. Got to check that out. That was on the bottom right screen in the quad box. And then was able to watch a handful of other games as well. Man, we had it wasn't a great day of college football across the board. There were a lot of one-sided affairs, but there were some sneaky good games like that Ohio State game. So we'll dive in. As always, like, rate, subscribe to the show wherever you get the show. Every rating you give us, every subscription you give us, all that stuff helps us. And we're just continuing to grow like crazy. So we so appreciate all of you that have helped support the show up to this point. All right, let's dive in. We'll start last night with Texas A&M and LSU because I think it's maybe the most dramatic game of the entire day, albeit not the closest margin of victory, but maybe the most dramatic game because of what transpired in it and some of the coaching decisions that were made in it as well. There you are. You're seeing LSU on the road in a hostile environment. Feels like they can do no wrong. They're up by 10. They're up 17-7. Seeing a lot of things that I like from their receiver core. Kyron Lacey's just playing strong physical football out on the perimeter. Nussmeier's playing great, all this other stuff. And then Mike Elko decides to say, hey, Connor Wigman, it's not your day. We're going to move on from you. We're going to go with the mobile option. We'll see if this defense that had been breathing fire for most of the evening, we'll see if this defense is now up to the test of being able to slow down a more mobile option at the quarterback spot. And the answer to that question was nope, they were not ready to contain Marcel Reed. They pull the plug. Reed goes in 4 consecutive drives that result in touchdowns. As a result of Marcel Reed's leadership, he didn't throw for some ridiculous number of yards. He wasn't hitting like these crazy throws and these throws that were in windows that were this big. No, there were nothing like that. But LSU, you could just tell they were immediately on roller skates, man. And as soon as he went in, changed what the offense's identity was. LSU had a great feel and a great cadence defensively in the first 2.5 quarters, the first 2 quarters and change, because they knew where that quarterback was going to be every single time the ball was snapped. Well, insert Marcel Reed. Things changed rather quickly. He marches them all the way back. The defense steps up tremendously, by the way. I don't feel like the defense right now, I'm reading all this stuff about the reactions about A&M's performance. And there's a ton of credit being given to Elko. There's tons of credit being given to Marcel Reed. And there's lots of credit going to Colin Klein. All that is completely fair, but let's not completely ignore the fact that they were able to turn Garrett Nussmeier over 3 times, 3 interceptions. They had a botched field goal snap, and then next thing you know, they're off and running. I also think that this is going to be an interesting thing to monitor moving forward because we had this conversation a few weeks ago. Who is the better option for this team, for this offense? And I had said leading into the Missouri game, shows how much we know, leading into the Missouri game, I get the sense that the offense might be the tiniest bit more efficient with Marcel Reed at the quarterback spot, just because the mobility aspect from the quarterback position just makes him more difficult to defend. just makes them tougher to defend. And with how they're running the football and how these backs are hitting the hole, how the offensive line has steadily improved, felt like, the mobile quarterback's going to help him out. Well, in goes Wigman, lights up Missouri. We look dumb. Now, a couple weeks later, Wigman's kind of regressing back to what he's been throughout his career. A little up and down, a little spotty from an accuracy standpoint, maybe a questionable decision or two. So Marcel Reed's legs open up this whole new world to A&M's offense. And I think they'll probably go with him next week because next week, hey, guess what? No picnic coming up next week. Texas A&M probably going to be in the top 10. If they're not, they should be. They're likely going to be in the top 10 going on the road at night to Williams-Brice Stadium at South Carolina. Just saying, that's a tough road trip to make fresh off an emotional victory to take soul standing at the top of the SEC standings. But either way, tremendous second half performance from A&M and a tough decision coming up for Mike Elko in his first year there in College Station. Ohio State and Nebraska. Now, this game, like I said, was on while we were on. So I haven't dove in to the tape. I haven't dove into the coaches' tape, so I will reassess this game today. But based on what I was able to see and consume, it looked like, and we know that Ohio State's offensive line, they are now without their left tackle, Josh Simmons, who was banged up, and this is their first game without him. And you could just sense that it just wasn't the same, right? It's not like Josh Simmons is Orlando Pace or anything, but the offense, there was a clear liability at the left side of the offensive line. And as a result, it really wasn't very good. You also, the injury, or the guy that replaced Josh Simmons, Zem Michalski, he didn't play very well. Then he gets banged up, but there's been a couple of injuries now to the left side, but a couple of sacks given up. So this will be something that will be interesting because is there a lot to learn about Ohio State's sluggish performance against Nebraska coming out of the bye week, knowing what's coming up next week? Probably not. Is it possible that they maybe have been looking a little bit ahead, especially looking at what Nebraska did last week at the hands of Indiana? Was it possible that maybe Ohio State wasn't all in on this performance? Yeah, I think it is. I think it's 100% possible. So that's why I'm not going to completely write off the Buckeyes just yet. A lot of people jump to conclusions about how this team has no chance. Not only do they not have a chance next week, but they might not even have a chance against the new Michigan offense that has certainly found its footing after their win this past weekend. I think people are overreacting a bit right now as it relates to Ohio State and the challenges that they had last week. They were going against the Nebraska team. Nebraska had just been embarrassed the week before. Completely embarrassed by Indiana. That's a proud program. You knew you were going to get their best shot. You did. It's just Nebraska's defense is good and has been good all year. And when their offense doesn't put them in difficult spots like they did last week, that group has shined from time to time. And they did. They made life difficult on the Buckeyes, especially on the Buckeyes offensive line. But this will be something that we'll be watching all week long because it could play a huge role in who ends up winning the game next week against Penn State. On to Penn State. Penn State gets the win. They go and they're in a halftime deficit, down 10-7. Drew Allar gets banged up. It appears like it's a knee injury. He was walking around gingerly when they showed him. That was right before halftime, but it's got to make you feel pretty good to know the backup, a guy that has been playing, right? Pribula has been playing for a while, and it's been more as a role player, but he was involved in the double pass not that long ago, and he's had plenty of meaningful snaps under his belt. So he was not at all wide-eyed when thrust into a difficult situation, especially with the way they were playing defense and the way that they were able to run the football. When Katron Allen and Nicholas Singleton go for nearly 200 combined, Penn State Nittany Lions are going to be very difficult to beat. Very difficult to beat. So we will be watching Drew Allar's knee. We'll be watching his availability. We'll be watching whether or not he can practice all week. And if not, then we know it's going to be Pribula against Ohio State there in Happy Valley next Saturday. The other thing about Wisconsin in this one, man, was was very impressed with what Wisconsin had done offensively in the last 3 weeks. It felt like they were taking some strides, right? It felt like Wisconsin, all right, they were not great early. Then they lose Van Dyke. They have to go with Locke. It wasn't great. Then they finally found something, starting to run the ball a little bit more consistently. And then, boom, they run into the brick wall that is the Penn State defense. And defense travels, man. This was a tough game. This was a tough environment. I think when you look at this game for Penn State, it will all be thrown away in the event in which they lose next week to Ohio State. Like, all goodwill will be destroyed if they lose at home to Ohio State. I get that. Should it be? Probably not, because this is still probably a playoff team regardless of the outcome of next week's game. But this was an impressive win. You lose your quarterback. You are in a halftime deficit. You have to rely on the backup and run game. You have to rely on the defense. You're in a hostile environment against a team that had played really well, and you have your bitter arch rival, your nemesis, coming up next week. Everything that could have gone wrong in this game, everything that could have happened in this game, Penn State resisted going down that rabbit hole. So frankly, I came away very impressed with the win. It was not statistically one that was gaudy. It was not one that you're going to walk out and say, oh my goodness, like if this team gets into a track meet, they're going to roll everybody. I didn't come out of it thinking that Penn State is without question a national championship contender. I do think, though, that this is a more mature team than they've had in the past. And I think that was a calloused performance. Like, those are the performances that if Penn State does make a run, gets to the semifinals, gets to the national championship game, wins a playoff game or two, this might be a game that you look back and circle and said, you know what, they kind of proved their mettle in that performance there in Madison, Wisconsin, right before they played Ohio State. All right, let's move to the SEC. Haven't done a whole lot on them. Obviously, did Texas A&M and LSU. A&M now leads the SEC, but right behind them, there's a bunch of teams. There's a whole bunch of teams right now that are trying to nip at A&M's heels. LSU now has one loss. Texas has one loss. Texas nearly had a second loss added to it. They were down early against Vanderbilt, and then Quinn Ewers went on a tear. I think he completed like 17 consecutive passes, which is pretty dang impressive. They go to Vanderbilt, and Vanderbilt, a lot of people refuse to acknowledge that Vanderbilt is improved. A lot of people just identify Vanderbilt as Vanderbilt, and if you lose to Vanderbilt, you're terrible. If you beat Vanderbilt, it doesn't matter because you should beat Vanderbilt. Well, I think this was a gutsy win from Texas. They didn't have their best stuff. They turned it over a couple times. Quinn Ewers still, I think, looks like he's a little bit affected by the oblique injury that sidelined him for a little bit. He did throw for nearly 300 yards, did have 3 touchdowns in the performance. But I do feel like he held the ball a little bit too long on a few sacks. And I also think there were a couple tipped interceptions that you can not necessarily put all the way on the quarterback. But Texas's defense, to me, was a little bit more of the story in this one. They were able to turn over Vanderbilt a handful of times. That was what Vanderbilt didn't do against Alabama, which led to the upset. If they had kept a clean sheet, maybe Vanderbilt would have had a chance. But that is a scrappy group that you don't want to mess with, man. So Texas, that's a good, solid win. You lose in heartbreaking fashion to your team last week in Georgia at home. To go on the road into a bit of a sleepy setting and to get a win is impressive. I don't care what the final score was. Speaking of teams that lost to Vanderbilt, how about Alabama? They're back in the good graces amongst the Tide faithful. A lot of people were the amount of people pressing the panic button right now with Alabama is over the top, guys. I mean, it's completely over the top. And I know that there is this picture in your mind of what Alabama's supposed to look like. And the standard is the standard. And, well, that never happened under Nick Saban. And that never happened under Nick Saban. And which never happened if Coach was still here. That's not entirely true. So I think there's a bit of a misconception about how the program has operated for the last 17 years. Yeah, the program's been fantastic, but there have been peaks and valleys in every season, including last year when they literally limped to the finish line in October with a couple of substandard performances, and in September last year when they really looked human. So this team the last 2 years has had some ups and downs in the first 8 or 9 weeks of the season. And then when they get into November, they played their best football. And that's what Alabama's now going to be able to do. They'll have a bye this week. They go and they pound Missouri. Really impressive performance. They ran for 277 yards and 4 touchdowns. They also, I know Jalen didn't light it up through the air, but I don't think that's what Alabama wanted in this game. They were trying to get back to the more traditional rushing attack that Alabama has long been known for. That's been a priority the last few weeks, and it's starting to really pay dividends because, while people can look at Missouri and say, well, Brady Cook wasn't out there, the offense clearly has a lot of limitations. All that is 100% true. But the defense is still pretty solid. And the defense has at times been a handful for teams. Now, it wasn't a handful for A&M, and it wasn't a handful for Alabama. But still, there's, I think, a lot to feel good about if you're the Tide. You survived. You've gotten a couple teams' best punches. You played poorly at Vanderbilt and you lost. You played okay, especially on defense against Tennessee. You lost in a tough game that I think is against a really good team in Tennessee. So now you head into November. You win on the road at Baton Rouge against LSU. You're back in the driver's seat to a potential playoff spot. But I do think November is a strengthening stretch as LSU is going to be angry, and Auburn is, I think, now playing a little better football. Now, their record wouldn't indicate it, but Auburn's been solid all season, and they finally break through against Kentucky this past weekend. Jarquez Hunter rushes for 278 yards and a couple touchdowns against a Kentucky team that looks like their best football is behind them, man. That is a Kentucky defense the last 2 weeks that is somewhat unrecognizable. I'm not sure what to make of it. I don't know what's going on. All I know is I've seen that group play 2 really impressive games against top-flight competition in Ole Miss and Georgia. I saw with my own 2 eyes, was on the call for both those games. The group that's taken the field against Florida and Auburn is not the same group. They're just not the same group, and I can't quite figure out. But Auburn is a team that's getting better as well. So SEC, very interesting. A&M's at the top. You got a bunch of teams with 1 loss that are super interesting. I think Alabama and a couple of 2-loss teams, still very interesting. Ole Miss is one of those teams who, by the way, how many sacks did Ole Miss record this past weekend? I think it was 10. Yeah, 10 sacks this past weekend against Oklahoma. Thought the bottom had fallen out when Oklahoma played against South Carolina. They had 9 sacks in that game. Well, raise you one with a new offensive coordinator, mind you. I guess it wasn't Seth Luttrell's fault because it wasn't. But Oklahoma gives up 10 sacks in their defeat at the hands of Ole Miss. So Oklahoma arrow pointing down, but some teams there in the SEC arrow pointing up. Ole Miss is one of them. And Ole Miss, by the way, Ole Miss in 2 weeks, they have a tough game this week. They go to Arkansas. If Arkansas can play anywhere near like how they played this past weekend, where Taylor Green was unconsciously good, they're going to be a problem for a lot of teams. Texas has them. Ole Miss has them. Georgia will be at Ole Miss here in 2 weeks, though. So if Ole Miss can survive this week at Arkansas, they'll have Georgia on their home field with a chance at redemption. So the SEC race, not saying necessarily for the SEC title, but the SEC race for teams, say, 4 through 8 is about to potentially get very interesting here in the weeks to come. A couple of surprise undefeated. Indiana, another convincing victory for Indiana over the Washington Huskies. Washington struggling. One thing I did not anticipate was Washington turning it over. But, man, I'm telling you, we've been talking a lot about Indiana's offense and Curtis Rourke and the quarterback situation and Taven getting his first start of the season and how that's going to be a huge problem. Well, it's not going to be a problem if their defense plays like that. And their defense has been really solid and opportunistic all season long. But this is a group that entered Saturday giving up just 4.3 yards per play allowed. I mean, that's pretty sporty. So defense and special teams is something that Indiana is now capable of winning with, in addition to their offense, which is really beneficial, especially considering you're going to be relying on a backup quarterback for quite some time. BYU went to UCF, another surprise, undefeated. It's kind of amazing. BYU is now 5-0 in the Big 12. They're 8-0 overall. They go all the way to UCF, go for 250 on the ground, and cruise to a victory in which they barely broke a sweat. Remember, BYU was an underdog in this game, an underdog. That's a pretty mind-blowing thought, because I looked at it and I said, man, if they're an underdog, does that make any sense? No. So, man, better take the favorite in this game. Took UCF, got this thing way wrong, because BYU went down there, handled their business, and had no problem doing it whatsoever. Kansas, Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, all these preseason favorites in the Big 12, they're pretty much nowhere to be found. And here we are looking up at BYU right now. Another team that they're looking up at is Colorado, who is now 4-1 in Big 12 play. 6-2 overall. Deion Sanders and co., they have punched their ticket to bowl eligibility. Really impressive. Their first time they've gotten to 6 wins since 2016. They take care of Cincinnati. Travis Hunter catches 9 passes for 153 yards, a couple touchdowns. He also on defense had 4 PBUs, pass breakups. Like, the guy's all over the field. But just, you can't feel a whole lot better than right now for Colorado, man. To get to where they're at, to get to the postseason, to get their 6th win. Remember, this is a team, when Deion Sanders arrived, this is a team that had been to 3 bowl games since 2008. All right? They haven't faced any of the top teams just yet, and won't. They don't have BYU. They don't have Iowa State. They don't have Kansas State. So they did face Kansas State, but they don't have them down the stretch. That's their one loss in the conference. They do face Utah, Kansas, and Oklahoma State, who are a combined 2-13 in Big 12 play. I say all of that to acknowledge the fact that we might very well be talking about Colorado here in a few weeks as a possible Big 12 contender. Yes, they're in the mix right now, but I'm talking like a legitimate Big 12 champion. And if you win the Big 12, remember, you get into the college football playoffs. So this thing could get very interesting very soon. One other undefeated that we need to acknowledge, even though they played on Thursday, want to give a little love to Pitt. It's not often when I see a team up 17-0 that I think had -3 offensive yards, but because of 3 consecutive interceptions thrown by Kyle McCord on the first 3 possessions, including 2 that were taken back to the house for pick sixes, Pitt had a very comfortable lead, and their offense really hadn't done a whole lot to show for it. They cruise an emphatic victory, 3 pick sixes in the game, 5 interceptions in the game. It was just a completely dominant and stifling performance for Pitt. They're undefeated. They'll head to SMU this weekend in what might be their most difficult test to date. SMU survives in a game that they really had no business surviving in. They turned the ball over 6 times, including twice in the fourth quarter, but they watched Duke miss a 42-yard field goal, and then they had a blocked 30-yard field goal as time expired. So the fact that SMU was able to win that game against Duke in spite of their 6 turnovers is truly insane. So Pitt travels to SMU in a pivotal game in the ACC. That'll be something that we watch. Michigan beats Michigan State. This is the recipe that you thought you might have from Michigan this year. Davis Warren thrust back into the starting lineup. People are calling his performance outstanding. I was like, he was 13 of 19 for 123 and a touchdown. He was fine. But that's all that we can really expect from the passing attack at this point. Doesn't all of a sudden make me believe that Michigan's going to go on some roll here offensively down the stretch. Alex Orji did what he needs to do. He contributed as a running threat, as a guy that could come in and kind of change things up, change up the looks for the defense, and Colston Loveland was the best player on the field. So that was a good win for Michigan against Michigan State. It was not one that I think was going to be super easy. We also want to tell you about our adopted sons, the Washington State team that is now 7-1. It's the first time they're 7-1 since Gardner Minshew was on campus back in 2018. They beat San Diego State. John Mateer, who very few people are familiar with, but that's Washington State's quarterback, threw for 257 and a couple touchdowns. He also ran the ball 21 times and caught a 2-point conversion in the Cougars' version of kind of the Philly special. So saw Philly special a few times this weekend, by the way. They successfully attempted it. Notre Dame and Navy saw it used by Navy unsuccessfully. Blake Horvath dropped the ball. Moving on to that game, Notre Dame handles Navy in convincing fashion. It was a complete beatdown, but Navy was really their own worst enemy. 6 turnovers by the Navy midshipmen. It was disappointing. We were on the call for it. It was disappointing because I'd studied Navy all week, right? Studied Navy all week. It's like, this is a really impressive outfit. This offense is really cool. Blake Horvath's excellent. They got good skill positions. The defense is opportunistic. So I'm sitting there thinking, all right, this can be kind of a fun game. It should be fun. I mean, I think the world will be interested in seeing what Navy can do against top-flight competition. And then they just completely wet the bed. Dropping pitches, fumbling exchanges. They had turned the ball over 2 times this whole season, and they both came in week 1. Week 1 stuff, jitters, trying to get stuff, it happens. But to turn over 6 times in week 8 against the best competition they faced up to this point, just not going to happen. Notre Dame rolls. Riley Leonard had a really solid day throwing the football and running the football, and Notre Dame's defense was really good, diving on those balls when they were there to be dove on. And it's not one that I can take a whole lot out of it, right? I mean, I think Notre Dame's really good, but my opinion about Notre Dame did not change as a result of the performance yesterday. Navy was terrible. I don't know how else to describe it. That'll do it for us here at Always College Football. Continue to ask all of you to like, rate, and subscribe to the show wherever you get the show. Always appreciate those of you that have followed us on the social media account, Always CFB. Jack does a great job of putting stuff out on that feed all throughout Saturday, all throughout the week. So check out Always CFB on Instagram and on Twitter or X. And you can always, of course, follow me at Greg McElroy. So for all of us here at Always College Football, like, rate, and subscribe. For Mark, Jake, Jack, the other Jack, I'm Greg. We hope you have an amazing day. We'll be back tomorrow with our 10 takeaways, our 10 things that we've learned after we do our deep dive into the weeds here on Sunday, like we do every single week. So check back with us tomorrow. We'll have a little bit deeper presentation about what went down this past weekend. So for all of us here at ACF, we hope you have a great day. And remember, it's always college football. Hey guys, it's Greg McElroy. Thanks for watching Always College Football. Make sure you like, rate, and subscribe to ESPN's YouTube channel and wherever you listen to your podcasts.